Welcome to Reclaiming Home, a podcast focused on delivering thoughtful conversation and tangible actions to make housing justice a reality in our communities. I'm your host, Asale Sol Young, Executive Director of Urban Homeworks, an educator, activist, and proud Turtle Papa. I'm a Black Legacy native of Evanston, Illinois, and a proud descendant of Haitians and rural Black and Indigenous North Carolinians. Join me as we take time each month to dive into all things housing, including potential policies, community dreams, persistent systemic barriers. We'll also celebrate success and everything in between. We are so glad you're here. Here at Urban Homeworks, we acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that European colonizers stole from the Dakota people indigenous to Minnesota. In order for this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We also acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that was cultivated and developed by bodies that European colonizers stole from West African countries through the transatlantic slave trade. In order for these thefts to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, forced assimilation were employed. As we acknowledge what was taken from our collective human ancestors, we commit to work and fight for the liberation of the descendants of those enslaved through American chattel slavery and the sovereignty of all Native peoples. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, Juan Luis. For those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to Reclaiming Home, Housing Justice with Urban Homeworks. Today, I am so excited to be joined by Juan Luis. And Juan Luis, I'd love actually for you to introduce yourself. Let us know what your preferred pronouns are in your job title and where you work.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. Super honored to be here. My name is Juan Luis. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a coalition organizer at the Alliance for Metropolitan Stability. I work primarily on our housing coalition, so the Equity in Place and the Housing Justice League.
Beautiful. And as a reminder, again, to folks joining for the first time or those who haven't listened in a while, my name is Asale Sol. I prefer they, them pronouns, and I'm the executive director of Urban Homeworks. And we are nearing our 30th year anniversary. We're in our 29th year as an affordable housing nonprofit. Our mission is to lead the fight for housing justice so that all people have a safe, stable, and dignified place to live. And our vision is very straightforward. It is housing justice for all. All right. So we just got out of this last legislative session. And just for reference for folks listening, this session, there was different housing legislation, but it was more of like a bonding year than necessarily a fiscal year. And so I would actually love, Juan Luis, if you can even break that down for folks, is like, what does that mean? Why should I be interested in those differences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing I learned this year, moving from last year, and shifting from policy year to a bonding year is really bonding is where the money needs to be spent. And the bonding year also is a year where no policy initiatives need to get passed in the sense that the priority of the legislature is just to get the bonding bills passed. That is the only obligation that they have. And if they really wanted to, that is the only thing they need to move this legislative session. So it makes moving policy and it makes moving bills that have funding attached to it a little bit more challenging, especially when the appetite at the Capitol is a little less there to move such transformational policy in a year where it doesn't require them to have to do such efforts.
No, that's really helpful for folks to understand. And so what was actually passed this session?
Yeah, it's a hard fought year. And we got a lot of housing provisions passed last year and some left on the table that we're trying to fight for this year. Um, some of the big ones that were passed this year were definitely a huge one in terms of providing more protections for folks suffering from domestic violence and being able to break their lease with more stringent protections and more accountability on the landlord side as well, and ensuring protection for the victims um, as they transition to more safe housing. And then also removes the barriers that folks would face in traditionally breaking leases with the financial consequences that comes with, and then also just the complications of navigating that system that comes with. So I think that was a huge bill that was hard fought this session that will have immediate impact coming this next month or in 2 months in August, as that one has been prioritized to go into effect as soon as possible.
That's amazing.
Um, yeah,
What were
moving from
sorry, really quickly, just what were the organizations leading that fight, that particular fight?
I'm not very sure on who was leading that particularly to give credit, but and I apologize for that, but I do know it was a major fight over the session with a lot of support across actually a bipartisan support across the legislature.
That's awesome. Thanks for that. What else is on the docket for housing?
Yeah, I think some other great bills that were passed in support. This one I do know who moved. Copal, Minnesota moved a really great bill for our undocumented migrant communities in our state, and expanding the individual identification tax pay number, which essentially gives folks who don't traditionally have a social security number the opportunity to use a number that is generated by the IRS for them to be able to file taxes and establish some sense of financial history within the country. And then also are able to use that for housing applications now and public utility applications, which up until this policy becomes live isn't something that is necessarily protected right now, which forces many of our immigrant families and undocumented families to live in the shadows in many cases, as it's a very large barrier when any applications for Social Security numbers of any sort. So being able to substitute that with an ITIN, which is the shorthand for the larger name, is really monumental, and just being able to move us towards more universal approaches in housing.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's incredible.
And then a big policy that my coalition and others in Equity in Place pushed this year is really establishing the rights for tenants to organize across the state of Minnesota, and not just establishing the right for tenants to organize with clear definitions of what activities are associated in organizing, but really the biggest part that the win that we really got out of the policy is the retaliations component attached to the policy. So it's not two separate policies, it's all in one policy of the actual protections and then the retaliation from those protections
Mm.
incorporated in one bill. So um, had to navigate the legislative session quite a bit, but luckily we're able to make it through pretty much intact. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a lot of good wins, a lot of really important wins. Can you expand upon the tenant protections bill and why the specific language is so important?
yeah, that's a great question. I think from my time prior to my employment here at the Alliance, I was a tenant organizer at Homeline, and I think this bill really it was really stirred from multiple experiences of myself and fellow organizers that I was working with, especially in multi-generational immigrant, primarily non-English speaking, primarily or I say multi-generational already, in the sense that there's multiple generations living in one unit. Um, Organizing with such populations requires an abundance of time, it requires an abundance of trust building, and it requires an abundance of patience and just navigating where folks are, right? The testament of meeting folks where they're at is truly true when you're organizing in any community, but even more particularly in those demographics of community. And the policy, we just realized it was so needed because there's so many barriers in just establishing um, foundation of community and the ability to be able to create a foundation of security and trust within the variety of properties that we're organizing in, where folks feel comfortable to talk to their neighbors, to actually
Mm.
build community with one another, to actually host different events and different things like that. And in the properties where that was prevalent and where it was happening, seeing the lack of the protections from folks as um, property management companies who are also having their own struggles of retention of staff and just a variety of factors that are present within housing. Those relationships don't always stay intact between property management and the community living there. And sometimes the consequences are folks lose those aspects of community that they built because that sense of community is replaced with fear. And it's replaced with a lot of just tension around how do I actually live with my neighbors as opposed to just living in the unit that I'm paying rent for and not feeling like there's a sense of home there. So a lot of it was just trying to reestablish for folks a foundation for us to be like, no, this is legal for us to build community together, to door knock, to talk to one another, to see each other as humans, um, and diminish the fear that is present in a lot of our communities across the state.
Absolutely. And can you talk about just what impact you anticipate this specific bill having on things like evictions and things like that?
Yeah, I think the largest thing is creating a foundation of support within community, right? I think the largest thing as an advocate working with eviction is it's the time, right? We're given a timeline now that we have to be able to effectively respond to navigating the court system or potentially finding new homes or new housing. Like, there's just a variety of different questions that we have to ask each other in that short time frame where um, having communities that aren't organized or having communities that aren't where folks are very isolated and these type of experiences makes it even more challenging for someone to get past the immediate emotional stump of like, wow, this piece of paper is literally saying that I'm going to be displaced from my home if I don't do X, Y, and Z. So that's like the immediate like it's 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 getting past that immediate human response of like, wow, this is happening, and it makes it even easier um, to respond to a proper time frame when folks have some sense of organized community that they can lean on to assist them in whatever it may be, right? If it's folks not able to pay rent that month, or if it's something in the unit broke and they're being accused of breaking it, just multiple different ways of being able to lean on your community to figure out if there's solutions that we can fix coming together, as opposed to having to go through the prolonged legal process that in a lot of cases tenants are very much at the mercy of, instead of in a relationship that's allows them a lot of autonomy or agency. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the biggest thing is being able to establish some sense of community for us to be able to lean on when we are facing situations as drastic as an eviction. But a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that is really just the need for even more protections, right? I think the right to organize is a step forward and enacting even more policies forward that would help us even further as to the topic of evictions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for elaborating on that. And in a similar vein, I'd love to just chat about the work on rental assistance and sort of moving that out the door, the Family Homelessness Prevention and Assistance Program. I'm wondering if you're able to speak to that at all. I think that those two pieces of legislative work go really well hand in hand.
Yeah, I think it's really great for us to just continue to expand different um, assistance that folks can tap into, especially at a more universal level from the state. Um, Especially as rent and transportation, housing and transportation are the largest costs for folks across the board. And housing just continues to rise. And if our goal is really to prevent folks from being displaced and being unhoused, we need more programs that are directly putting funds into the hands of renters to be able to continue to pay their rent. So I think the Family Supportive Housing Act, I think, is a great step in establishing at the state not only just money, but also just the recognition that this is something that we need to continue to invest in going forward. and also recognize we have a lot of debt, or not a lot of debt. We have a lot of money that we had to pay forward from the years where we lacked that, and the years of folks that suffered from not having that infrastructure in place. Um, so I think that is huge, and I think it even goes to and there might be a question here later, so sorry, prevent me if this is not where we want to go. But also, like I think as great as it is to get money into folks' hands, the fact that we weren't able to get source of income protections passed this year, um, it's kind of that double whammy of the recognition that we need to subsidize folks' ability to live in their homes because the cost of housing has just gotten to the point where it has been to a point where it's just unattainable. Um, you need to have both. You need to
Absolutely.
have the sources that are giving the money directly to folks, and you need to have the vouchers that are able to alleviate folks' ability to find housing.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. Those two things are important. And I mean, as you know very well, the work with the legislature takes a long time and it has to be consistent. We have to keep coming back to the table around these things. And so I know that that fight is not over just because, it was a no this round.
Mhm.
Um, but I do think it's important to note that the emergency assistance program was funded $8 million. I think as a small landlord, a small affordable housing landlord, that's really important for us, because it extends those COVID protections to help support both residents and landlords that are really working to be a good neighbor, right, to community, to say like we are
Mhm.
providing dignified housing and making sure that both ends of that agreement are getting upheld. So I think that is really exciting. Um,
Yeah, that's a really powerful point. I mean, we saw kind of the negative aspects in COVID of when that relationship isn't symbiotic or when that those two parties aren't on the same page, the impacts that it has. So I think that's incredibly powerful to point out the importance of that relationship there.
Absolutely. Are there any other bills that you're excited that did get passed? Excited about that did get passed?
Um, Well, there's a variety of different updates to 504B that were pushed from Homeland that were necessary, and that 504B, for folks who aren't familiar, that's the tenant landlord statute within the Minnesota larger laws. So that's where you can find your tenant landlord laws under that 504B statute area. Um, so a lot of the bills in there are really great in their intention of providing tenant protections, but a lot of those bills were written almost 50, 60 years ago. So life has changed quite drastically in the last half century or more. So
Right.
just the need to update some of the provisions that the court does in relation to expungement of evictions, some more clarification of last year's provisions around the immediate expungement of evictions that went through. There were some changes that had to go through to make the administrative side of the judicial branch be able to move that more effectively. So a lot of like nuanced technical things that unfortunately I'm not the legal whiz in being able to articulate, but a lot of them was really just recognizing some of the infrastructure that wasn't addressed and moving such monumental reforms to the judicial process last session that needed to be tweaked going into this session. So um, all in all is to say that the attempt is to make the judicial process recognize the time that is needed for tenants to be able to actually have agency in navigating housing court, which is this is a big issue in the sense that I don't think that is very much has been present in our history of housing court in our state.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's right. And it is really about deepening equity for folks that tend to be on the margins of housing justice. And so it's another good year, I think, for us as a state in terms of housing. I'll just highlight a couple of things that kind of speak a little bit into what you touched on. Um, so we have the 50 million allocation in community stabilization. Um, expansion of housing infrastructure bonds, which now includes cooperative housing. Like that's dope.
Mhm. Mhm.
Like that needs to be uplifted. As you know,
Mhm.
for us, like we're starting a cooperative project with Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. And so definitely believe in more cooperatively owned housing. It's
Yes.
something that Black and Brown folks have been doing all over the world for a very long time.
Yes.
We know that it works to keep folks connected and community connected within their housing. So we
Hmm.
celebrate the state starting to figure that out, right?
Yes. Yes.
Um, there's also um, expansion for supportive housing projects, um, for permanent residency, including foreclosures, abandoned housing projects, for affordable home ownership and rental housing. So that is good news. Really prioritizing low income residents, whether renters or first time buyers, to, to grant greater opportunity for just stable housing. Um, let's see, I just want to kind of list a couple here. We also have Metro sales tax expansion, statewide local housing aid. Um, the eligible projects for the Metro sales tax now include financing the operations and management of financially distressed residential properties in Minnesota. This is massive because our homes were
Hmm.
all mostly built in the 1920s. And
Hmm.
whether you're a renter, a landlord, small landlord, large landlord, that is significant. Again, if we're thinking about dignity in housing and housing justice, again, supportive services getting a bump as well. Um, Increase of funding to emergency shelters, and exemptions for rehab projects um, that exceed ADA requirements. So that is also really good news. Um, yeah, and so I'd love to move from just those quick hits to kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive into the 2040 plan, which kind of
Hmm.
gets us into zoning a little bit.
Hmm.
Um, have you been tracking the 2040 and that whole fight at all?
Um, a little bit. I think as an organization, we have very many touching points from transportation and to this place. So yeah, 2040 has definitely been within our scope of how we bring justice and housing justice and anti-displacement throughout all the different plans that Minneapolis is having. But it was really interesting to see the fight at the state legislature that also happened, and just seeing the variety of different debates that happened and the different testimonies and the different folks who were the same cities that were testifying. It was very fun. It was a lot of like legal political theater, which I quite enjoyed. But
Yeah,
it
that's
was
great. For
very,
those who couldn't be there, yeah, can you bring us into some of those stories and some of those arguments?
yeah, I think a lot of folks just recognize the battle between NIMBYism and YIMBYism, right? For to break those down, YIMBYism is yes in my backyard and NIMBYism is no in my backyard. So those a lot of the to break those down, I think the no in my backyard folks like are really concerned around density and wanting to ensure that zoning is not as densified. So that's where you see a lot more single family housing, a lot more straight like commercial zoning, and that there's like a main street instead of like these mixed use residential commercial properties. And then YIMBY is where we see like what is currently happening in the city of Minneapolis and single family lots, traditional single family lots being converted into some uh, multi-unit lots in the same acreage that would be classified as a single family. So you're seeing more density arise in the city, which there's been articles that have given the administration of the city credit in reducing housing in comparison to larger municipalities across the state. In a lot of cases, because the density is leading to more units being put on the market, and as the narrative goes, more housing brings the pricing down. So that's kind of where you see a little bit of that, and to bring it to what was going on with the Capitol is very much that fight of a lot of folks within the first core suburban ring, so like that St. Louis Park, Hopkins, Edina, kind of those kind of suburbs, to the Minneapolis, St. Paul inner cities, really arguing for the need for cities to be able to expand or be more have more options in their tool belt to expand, especially these cities that are landlocked in the sense that they don't have any more free land for them to purchase and grow. Their only options are going to be to densify. So, zoning reforms at the local level in policy is quite challenging, especially at the small suburban city level where it doesn't take much to really stall a process. Having more tools from the state help also local jurisdictions and being able to justify the need for more affordable housing to be built in suburban cores, for the need for just more densification to happen in suburban cores, where we have seen in some cities active pushback against that type of development. So it's really interesting to see city staff from a variety of different cities and city council members. So you saw the duopoly of the bureaucratic kind of staff perspective and also the people elected perspective of that sense. And then you got to hear from comedians themselves, right? You got to hear from folks who are just constantly coming to the Capitol and really grateful for them taking the time out of their day, some of them paid and some of them unpaid, to continue to voice just the challenges that folks are experiencing in relation to finding and affording housing. So it was a really powerful, committee hearing in that you saw entities that traditionally aren't very public in their stances around housing, are very public in their stances around how we decrease or how we create more affordability within housing, take kind of really clear stances on where their perspective is in relation to the Minneapolis 2040 plan and then that larger expansion that went to the state.
Right. That's really interesting. And I'm sure that just to your point, interesting perspectives may have been exposed in that process. It has been interesting from our perspective to kind of witness the very local lawsuit against the city around the environmental impact of increasing density. And I think that, it is a valid question to say, what are we preparing for? But ultimately, we also know that those with the increase of those without housing has environmental impacts, economic impacts that folks aren't speaking to enough, right? That ultimately not taking care of each other is the most costly thing that we can do. It is the most expensive thing. And when we house folks, when we take care of folks, when we stabilize them, both the environment and social infrastructure as well as financial infrastructure greatly improves. And so I'm really excited that on a local level, specifically for the city, that we were able to win
Mm.
that lawsuit in the short term. And obviously, there's a lot more work to do around the specifics of the 2040 plan and zoning. But I think that I can say that a lot of folks across Minneapolis are weary of our consistent tent encampments and the increase of those, and really
Hmm.
wanting to see our neighbors housed. And so, yes, your unit might be smaller than a single family home, but we know with our work in partnership with Blue, that you can still have the same number of
Hmm.
bedrooms that you need to support your family and the same number of bathrooms to support your family,
Hmm.
um, while making sure others have the same opportunity. And the cost is much more effective for the family. As a developer, it's not any cheaper, to be
Hmm.
clear, but for the
Hmm.
families that
Hmm.
have the opportunity to move into spaces like that, it's a huge cost savings, and it allows more people to buy those first homes that the economy of this country is ultimately built on at this point. So
Yeah,
I
I
think
mean
it's great.
those untraditional apartment units were what made my whole early adolescence, right? Like there's an apartment building shoved in the attic of a single family home and that was home, like It's not it's temporary in a lot of cases because a lot of cases housing still rises in so many cases that we move so much. But yeah, I think like I still think back of those days of yeah, walking all the way up 3 stories to get to an attic of a single family home. Like, yeah, this is an apartment here.
Yes, and that, you mentioning that brings me back to, like pre-civil rights justice in this country, right? And it's like so many Black families grew up in spaces just like that. And so, um, I think that having this public discourse around it versus how it was in the
Hmm.
past, where it's like the secret
Hmm.
thing and it's,
Yeah,
and there's all these tenant protections now that can come with the increase of density, like that's how we make progress,
yeah.
as we take those realities out of the shadows, and
Yeah.
talk about them publicly. So I'm
Also like
excited about what could come next. Yeah, go for it.
it's also like the shift to what you were naming, like shifting it gives me a lot of energy to shift to see some of the shifts going from reactive to proactive, right? Like it bothers me so much that a lot of our reactions to the unhoused population within our city is just such a reactive response, right? And we don't recognize the preventatives that we could be doing to prevent folks even from getting to that point and recognizing the complexities and the nuances of that preventative, of what it looks like to do that. But in my opinion, I think it is so much more be preventative and all the complexities that that means, as opposed to trying to be reactive. And in a lot of cases, our reaction is just shifting folks across the board. It's just shifting them from neighborhood to neighborhood to neighborhood, just so that out of sight, out of mind. That's not
Right.
solving anything.
That's right. No, I appreciate that point. Moving a problem does nothing for the uplift of society overall. And so, yes, I'm total agreement. Let's keep talking about these things and keep doing the hard work of being proactive because now we know enough, right? It's like we've seen this thing move through history. And we see the present day reality where across the country, really, tent encampments are growing. And so this is a great, I think again, Minnesota is doing a great job in setting a precedent for housing justice as a state. But there are things that did not make it through, and you started to touch on this a little bit already. But what are some of the? I would say, just given our timeline, what are your greatest disappointments out of this session?
Yeah, I think source of income is the biggest, in the sense of like, um, it's not just Section 8. There's so many other vouchers. There's so many other abilities that folks receive assistance to pay for their housing. Um, and folks are just being blatantly discriminated against. So it goes back to this like if we're trying to be preventative, if we really want to be serious about preventing folks from being unhoused in this place, that's number one, right? We need to expand folks' ability to actually be able to find housing, afford housing, and live in dignified housing. Right now, we're incentivizing a group of landlords to be able to take advantage of a captive audience in the sense of if folks aren't able to find housing with their vouchers, they still have to find housing. Um,
Mhm.
but it doesn't always mean that the housing is going to be dignified.
That's right.
So
That's right.
that's like that was a big one. I think that's just a constant fight, and it's something that I think a lot of folks in our state are going to continue to fight um, and push because it's just not. It just doesn't make any logical sense to not provide protection for folks um, simply for trying to find housing. And I understand there's other nuances on the landlord side of like the agreements and the contracts, but I try to look at this from the human side of folks need to be able to find somewhere to live. And the more barriers we have in that, then the harder that is. Um, on the same line,
Absolutely. And I'll just say, like, again, as a nonprofit landlord, it makes it harder for us to live into our mission of dignified housing if we are not able to work with residents that can't pay rent, right?
mhm,
Where does that income come from
mhm,
for capital improvements and just basic maintenance, right?
mhm.
If the government isn't providing it somewhere, right? There has to be a give somewhere. And I think that I just want to continue to to bring that awareness to conversations that it's not always landlords versus tenants, that actually the
Mhm.
most effective way to get this done is to say, again, especially in the nonprofit space, that some landlords and small for-profit landlords, even that are community-based, are really working to do their small part to help the situation.
Mhm.
Um, and it's all of us really coming up against our electeds to say, like, y'all have to do more, because if people's
Oh yes.
incomes are not meeting the demand,
Hmm.
I want to be able to provide dignified housing, but how do I do that if I don't have any
Hmm.
surplus?
Hmm.
And so we look to the government to help us figure that stuff out, and that's exactly how it should be.
Yeah, and
Um,
also recognizing there needs to be some serious reforms to our federal housing programs. Section 42, Section 8, LIHTC as a whole, right?
mhm,
4D tax
mhm.
credit as a whole,
Yes,
throwing a lot of
yes,
acronyms out there, but as a whole, across the board, a lot of these just need to be modernized,
yes,
right? We are living, our country is in a whole different state from when a lot of these policies were instituted in what, the 80s, 70s,
that's
60s.
right. That's right.
Um, a lot of things have happened since then.
That's right.
Um,
Absolutely.
and I don't think a lot of times these programs are suitable to the realities of the tenant and the reality of the landlord and developer in our current
Mhm.
state. So I think it pushes all of us, right? It's like the scarcity mindset that we face within
Yes,
community, right? Like when we're in scarcity, we start to fight with each other because
yes,
we're all just trying to fight for that crumb. Uh, so yeah, totally agree with your point. It's a whole cycle of accountability of how do we create the relationship between tenant and landlord, right? Which is something that a lot of folks are working on doing. But then also how do we lean and how do we pressure and how do we hold accountable our elected officials, not just state elected, but federal, but really the ones that need to start moving on modernizing some of our protections at the federal level to meet the actual demands of what we're facing on the ground because it's hard. As an advocate, it's so hard when you hear the both sides of things and you're like, well, honestly, there's not a clear solution in either way because both parties here are strapped. And we always lean towards the tenant perspective, but in a lot of ways, like there's just no money. There's no housing. There's no, there's no a lot of things.
that's right, Juan Luis. I mean, that's a really great point, and I appreciate you just kind of leaning into that a little bit. Um, and hopefully our audience just appreciates the overall conversation. Like, yes, we're talking about specific legislation, but for both the Alliance and Urban Homeworks, we care about these things because it is about people at the center, and it's about making sure that our communities have what they need to survive first and foremost, but ultimately to thrive, because we all deserve that.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and there were some significant bills in addition to source of income that did not get passed. Again, any others that for the Alliance and your work specifically that were quite disappointing?
Um, yeah, I would say like we were really energized and excited around Representative Bajay's corporate landlord bill.
Yes.
Super shout out to her for even taking that mantle
Yes,
on. It's a
that's
pretty
right.
big, it's a pretty big fight to try to enact in a society that is as capitalistic as ours.
That's
Um,
right.
but she's a fighter. So to break that down for folks, essentially, the goal would to have limited corporate limited liabilities, so CLPs, from consolidating more than 10 single family houses or more. So their portfolio couldn't consist of 10 single family housings or more before they would have to sell off their additional properties. Um, we
And
were
can you
really energized to just
talk about why that matters for folks that are just less familiar?
Yeah, I mean, we can name it, right? I think folks in our neighborhoods in North and areas of South and portions of South of St. Paul on the east side and the west side, right? Seeing these large, in a lot of cases, out-of-state entities, private equity firms coming in, and consolidating single-family homes and converting them to rentals. So not only are they taking off homes from the market from potential first-time home buyers, or folks that are looking to establish ownership roots in communities, um, taking that off the market, and particularly our most prevalent BIPOC, Black and Brown communities. And the second part is converting these single family homes to rental properties that in a lot of cases are very expensive, aren't well maintained, aren't in a condition where folks like are are going to be able to move into a home and not be worried that their water system is going to continue to work, or that the plumbing is going to continue to work, or that their door will actually be properly fastened to the frame of the house, very, or that the home will be properly insulated enough so that their energy costs aren't skyrocketing in the winter and in the summer, trying to keep their home warm or cold. Um, just just a variety of different touch points that are created when these homes are consolidated by an entity who, and this is my opinion, really just look at them as profit
Mhm.
vehicles. And I really don't think that they're looking at them as the ability to provide housing for anyone, but really as a mechanism that's going to generate their stockholders profit.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I would say that at Urban Homeworks, we agree with you that at that level of being an outside entity, that it's really hard to see the rental relationship as a very human one. Because in many cases, you're a corporate landlord, you never interact with your tenants. And so they're very much dollars. And we recognize that part of the drive of the cost of living is a result of corporate landlords coming in because they can pay cash for these homes. And as exactly as you said, they rent them for well over their value and they don't maintain them. And so they really are a blight on our communities. And they focus on communities that they feel like have less voice, which is
Hmm.
why they go into Black and Brown communities and
Hmm.
communities with lower incomes like North Minneapolis, um, like Franklin in South Minneapolis, in those areas. So
Hmm.
we will keep fighting alongside Akbaje to pass that. Absolutely. Um, yes. Anything else?
Uh, yeah, I think a lot of the great work that folks are pushing around the constitutional amendment would be really great, and that it frames housing as a priority, right? It forces housing as a priority, that comes with dollars, not just dollars for the development and the preservation of existing properties and development of new properties at an affordable rate, but also to what we were speaking about earlier, just the influx of rental assistance that it also will come with, that will always be there. Um, but another aspect of it, right? Like I think the housing amendment is incredibly important to shift housing to a larger frame within our state and making sure that housing isn't continued to be left on the back burner as we enter budget years, as it traditionally has been. Shout out to our chairs for fighting as hard as they have the last couple of years,
Yeah,
but traditionally housing has been ignored forever. And housing is the pinnacle of everything. It's not everything, but it's where everything starts.
exactly.
Um,
The
so
foundation.
it's the
Yeah.
foundation. So I think that's a large win in getting that to the finish line at some point. But I think it also ties to the need for source of income protection because what does it mean for us to allocate more, at this point, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars towards programs that are just giving people false hope? Not that
Mhm.
the program isn't succeeding, it's that folks aren't able to utilize their voucher.
That's
Folks
right.
aren't able to utilize the support that they need to subsidize their home.
That's right.
Um, and that's just a part of me that irritates me a lot. And like I love this additional amount of money that we're allocating to these things, but without clear protections for that money, it's just sitting there. It's just a pool that folks are able to look at and not swim in. Um,
I love that
so
metaphor. Really love that
it's
metaphor.
just yeah. So I
Mhm.
think that's another big one. In addition to a bunch of different policies that I think the folks are doing a really great job of pushing, but I think those three, if they would have succeeded this session, would have been groundbreaking for
Yeah,
not just tenants in the state of Minnesota, but really for our country and moving the country in the direction of like, hey, these are things that can be accomplished.
that's right. It would have been revolutionary. And just for context, I know the constitutional amendment for folks that don't work in housing is a little bit elusive. So just to kind of break that down, the proposals to raise the sales tax by less than 1%, 3/8 of 1%, 38 cents for every $100 spent. So a very low amount, a very low increase, but that in itself would help to fund housing initiatives into perpetuity. This is similar to the Legacy Amendment, which was passed in 2008. That 56% of Minnesota voters approved at that time, that 3/8 again of 1% sales tax hike to fund environmental initiatives, including arts and culture programs. So this is not a new or novel concept here in the state of Minnesota by any means. It's just, to Juan Luis's point, it's prioritizing housing specifically, which historically we have not done a good job at. And we need that stable housing funding. We need to protect it because I think that, as you spoke to, this opportunity of who is representing housing at the legislature, this is not going to come around again anytime soon. And so we had to push, and we will keep pushing, but the fight will get harder. I'm actually certain of that. But thank you so much for just sharing those pieces. I know that when you're at the legislature daily, it gets really emotionally exhausting, and sometimes you wonder if your work is effective. And just as an ally to the Alliance, as a partner to the Alliance, we just thank you for your hustle and your work, Juan Luis. You're an exceptional partner to us. We love working with you all, and really enjoy working with you specifically. So as we come to our wrap up, I want us to end on some positives, keep everybody engaged and energized around housing justice. So Juan Luis, what are you hoping to see in this next session in 2025?
Yeah, I'm hoping to meet back with our legislative allies and to hit the ground again to bring even more tenant protections for folks. We've accomplished a lot of great things, but unfortunately, there's even more protections we need to establish if we really want to create an equitable housing ecosystem. So some policies that come straight to mind, right? Just cause evictions protections. I think it's a great tool to not only educate tenants and what are the causes that they can put themselves in precarious situations, be evicted for, and ensuring that folks like are familiar and educated on what those clear causes are. I think having an educated tenant base helps both parties. It helps folks be able to avoid the stress of potentially violating one of those causes and going through that eviction process. And also helps, I think, the management companies and also understanding the clear parameters of what clear causes are. I think it also disrupts some of the tension that is arise when there isn't clarity and what those tensions and what those causes are. So I see it not only as an anti-displacement tool in establishing clear policy that has a timeline that extends folks some feet, brings some more life into a process that like strips life away from you, um, and navigating an eviction. But then also the second part of just seeing it as a bridge to educate and build community, not just amongst the tenants in a community, but also the property management, the landlords as well, to come together and being able to see eye to eye on what the causes are here. I think is a great way, and it's policy that exists in the state of Minnesota already in our manufactured housing, mobile home communities, and I've used it in my organizing in that setting to really effectively educate our non-English speaking and immigrant communities, our folks that need that additional clarity and what our causes are and what precarious situations or what precarious things could lead to them to being in a precarious situation. So that's a big one that would love to see pushed. In addition to just naming the ones that were left on the table last year, I think another big one, and this is one that we've seen, right? We've seen St. Paul move a really monumental rent stabilization policy. We saw the fight last year in Minneapolis to try to replicate the same. Um,
Mm-hmm.
just seeing the need for we've been working with a population of LIHTC senior residents in multi-generational Black and Brown residents, primarily in immigrant, non-English speaking residents that are living in a variety of our Section 42 affordable housing properties and just seeing the drastic rent increases that folks are facing in those properties and just recognizing the drastic impacts that is having on populations where they are on a fixed income, right? A lot of those folks are either on Social Security if they fall into that senior population, or are on some type of not all folks. I don't want to classify the whole other multi-generational demographic as this, but a good chunk of Section 42 residents also have different vouchers that they use to pay for their rent in addition to out-of-pocket costs. So you have a variety of different populations that to an extent are on a fixed income. They're on some sense of fixed money that they use to pay for their housing. And as costs of rent continues to rise, a lot of those folks just don't have the options to meet that additional cost unless they are it forces, we're talking about 80-year-olds going back into the workforce. To work almost full-time hours in addition to be able to just pay for housing, um, when they're supposed to be in their retirement years. And then it also means like multi-generational families having almost everyone working within the household and then potentially leaving an um, elder relative or a younger relative with another family member or alone at the home temporarily. So it just forces families into precarious situations in order to keep up with the rise of rent. And then I understand that also the other side of like the rising costs of actually maintaining and developing housing as well. So goes back to my point as well of like this is where we have to find local solutions, but really also recognize that there's a lot of efforts that need to be amplified at the federal level to really like modernize and recognize the drastic needs that are present in our federal housing provisions that um, make it so much harder for us to mediate these live tensions when folks like emotions are such at a high rate because their housing's on the line.
Mhm.
And then businesses are stressed as well, and their staff is stressed, and their staff is turning over, and it's just a mess. We're in a crisis. It's a crisis.
That's right. That's right. Well summarized. Thank you for that. Um, as we wrap up, I'd love to just hear a dream you have for your community. I actually don't know what you consider your community. Are you willing to share what you consider your community?
Yeah, I was born on the West Side, so I'm very much like Latino West Sider here and here. That's always my community, and the West Side always lives in my heart of West Side of St. Paul. But really, my community for me, um, I actually did a training the other day that asked what I identify myself as. I mean, I identify myself as a collectivist in the sense that my community is all the working class people, multi-generational, multiracial, multilingual, that are all trying to fight for dignity, for stability, and to try to change our community in a way that moves us from being so market-oriented, number-oriented, to bringing humanity back into
Mm,
our society. So a large vision for me is a lot of the work that I am trying to work and do with my fellow coalition members of the Housing Justice League and really trying to create this vision of what does it mean to have community ownership and engaging in the variety of conversations with community. We've done door knockings and hosting barbecues and kickoffs of hearing folks' inspirations for what they would do if they had full ownership over their community, not just as it relates to the house that they are occupying, but the businesses, the green space, the way that their street is made, like all of that is just fascinating to me. So that's my big dream.
I love it. What a beautiful dream. What a beautiful vision. Thank you so much for your time today, Juan Luis. Really appreciate you again. Really appreciate your work and your partnership. Um, For those of you listening, I hope that you have found this conversation, while technical in some aspects, I hope that you have found it very informative. We are in an election year, and as Juan Luis said, we cannot only focus on local policy and politics. We also have to look out federally and hold our federal electeds accountable as well, and that includes our presidential candidates. Um, it takes every aspect of government, and it takes each and every one of us to make the changes that we need to see our communities thrive. So if you are not already following us on social media, please do so. We are at Urban Homeworks on every platform. That includes places like LinkedIn, it includes X, Facebook, etc., Instagram. Is there anything that you want to plug, Juan Luis, or any tags that you would like to share with our audience?
Okay, we had the Alliance is hosting an Actualizing Equity, and the topic will be integrating anti-displacement and transit evolution. So this will be focusing on the Blue Line corridor work that is cutting through North Minneapolis for folks who might be out of town. Um, that will be this Friday, July 12th. Or no, not this Friday, 2 Fridays from now, July
I was like,
12th,
July
from
12th already?
from 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Um, and it will be over Zoom. I'll send over the invitation link to y'all, and if
We
you
will share it
feel
with
free to
our
share it
audience.
around your network, and yeah,
Perfect.
but yeah, would love for folks to tune in. You can also check out our website, the Alliance at Metropolitan Stability, and can find the registration link there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope that everyone has a wonderful week and weekend. It is Pride weekend as we are recording this on June 28th. So happy Pride, everyone.
Free Pride.
And, keep your pride inclusive. See you all next time. Thank you so much for tuning in to Reclaiming Home, Housing Justice with Urban Homeworks for today's discussion. If you like this podcast and want to support Urban Homeworks housing work, head over to www.urbanhomeworks.org/donate to make a gift, attend a future event, volunteer with us, or learn more. Until next time, remain connected and informed.